Nancy Stevenson.
Today, we're remembering Nancy Stevenson. I have such sweet memories of her from the very beginning when I came to this church. We had things in common. My mother was very active in UMW, and so was Nancy. And they served together at the conference level and shared back and forth about UMW whenever my mother would come to visit. Nancy loved the children of this church unconditionally. She was just wonderful. She would come on Saturdays and be here by herself, getting her Sunday school class ready, having her lesson ready. Many of us worried about her being here by herself and going up the steps, but she continued well into her 90s. She taught Sunday school here for over 50 years. She was a quiet lady, always with a smile, and I've never heard her say anything bad about anyone. I asked my son for a memory, and Nathan sent this to me last night, and I'd like to read it to you from one of her children. I think Miss Stevenson modeled unconditional love in a special way. I, of course, didn't appreciate it enough as a kid, but thinking back, she always met children where they were. It didn't matter if they were wild or perfectly well behaved. She treated us all the same, whether it was when she spoke to us in the Sunday school class or met us in the parking lot. She was always excited to see us, whether we were 8 or 28. And I think coming from that memory, that says a lot, and many of our children could say something like that because she has loved so many of the children of this church over the years. Today, we remember Nancy Stevenson.
Bill Herzer.
William Arno Bill Herzer. A lot of the membership probably didn't know Bill, but they certainly knew Sharon, his wife, Kendall, and other family members. Bill's from the military family and he moved around a lot. He served in Vietnam, where he was awarded 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. Bill was fishing with his best friend soon after he got out of Vietnam, and he knew that there was a difference in his friend, and he asked him what had changed in his life. And his friend told him, "When I accepted Jesus Christ into my heart, that's when I changed." Bill was so impressed that he accepted Jesus into his heart right then, right there. And he asked his friend to baptize him, which he did. Bill was always friends with everyone he came across. His neighbors knew him as he knew their neighbors by name. He was so much to so many people. He gave his whole heart to everyone who was around him, but he especially gave his heart to God. He was a research scientist, a friend, a husband, a father, and a papa. One of the last things that Bill did at our church was trunk or treat, and he totally enjoyed it and was beginning to give his heart to our church, but his heart, as I said earlier, was always with God. His students knew him and loved him and talked all the time about what an influence he was in their lives. He practiced the Bible, reading the Bible daily. He practiced the guitar and Spanish lessons almost daily. He loved kindness and he loved love, and this what was truly made Bill what he was. His family said that he probably knows the angels around him name now in heaven, and he's also probably repaired a couple of hinges on the pearly gates for St. Peter. Our church remembers Bill Herzer.
Cecil Green.
Many of y'all know the story of how a young man and young lady ran away from their home in Bakersville, North Carolina, and came to a small town in Tennessee to get married. They married and eventually settled in Johnson City. One of their children, a boy, was named Cecil Green. Cecil and his family were raised in this church. Cecil married Sandy, and they had their children, and they were raised in this church. I have known Cecil many years and have worked with him as a trustee and also on the building committee. The connector that we see here behind us was one of the last projects that I worked on with Cecil, as well as a major renovation in the church. Cecil did more for this church than most people will ever realize. Today we remember Cecil Green.
Phyllis Eorgan.
Today we are remembering Phyllis Eorgan. Phyllis was a dedicated member of the Friendship Sunday School class, along with her husband Tom. She was a devoted wife, mother, and a treasured friend to many of us. As we read the scriptures about Jesus' ministry on this earth, it seems that every day almost he was helping someone in need. And when we think of those needs, we think of Phyllis, because her almost 40 years nursing career, she helped many, of course, daily, and cared for them with just kindness and loving care and compassionate care. She was recognized by her peers for the kind of work that she did, and she did it so compassionately. Phyllis, too, was known for writing cards, and she would send her cards, and when she would write those cards, she would do personal messages in there in her own handwriting. And many of us who were blessed by receiving her cards were encouraged in our faith journeys. Phyllis was a loving, kind person. We are grateful for the cherished memories that she shared her life with us when she was with us. In her later life, she had an extended illness. Devoted family showed their devotion for her just as she has shown her devotion to them by caring for her and keeping her at home until her passing. Today, we fondly remember Phyllis Eorgan.
Johnny Moore.
Johnny Moore has been a member of First Methodist Church for a lifetime, actively serving on many of the church's committees in his early years. His father and mother, Housley and Mildred Moore, were all members of First United Methodist, along with his two sisters, Linda and Patricia. He was active in many of the church's sports activities. He worked with his parents in downtown Johnson City, Moore's Furniture Company. After they passed, he worked at Zach's Furniture for many years. The Bowmans said he was their best salesman because he was honest and he knew the business. Customers always came back to him for his needs. Quiet and unassuming, but always with a twinkle in his eye while you talked to him. He loved baseball, especially the Yankees, keeping a Yankee cap on his head at home whenever there was a game. Johnny married Janice and had a daughter, Lindsay, who loved her dad. He loved his grandchildren and had an annual trip to Myrtle Beach with all the family. I remember Johnny always sitting in the rear of the church in the same seat. In his later years, he had medical problems and couldn't leave the house. But Janice was the perfect wife and caregiver until the end. A devout Methodist that loved his church. Johnny Moore. Today, the church remembers Johnny Moore.
Barbara Mars.
Barbara Mars was part of this church family since birth. In her teenage years, she was an active choir member, often singing solos on Sunday services. She loved her time spent with the friendship class, whether it be in Sunday school or other activities they participated in. Family retreats at Buffalo Mountain held very special memories, as well as the time spent at camp there as a teenager. Barbara loved chaperoning the youth on Myrtle Beach trips in the 60s. Attending her church was the highlight of Barbara's week. She did this for as many years as she was able. Today, the church remembers Barbara Trevathan Mars.
Michael Kellum.
Michael Kellum was born on September the 29th, 1956. Mike was adopted when he was just a few days old by Dennis and Marie Kellum. Mike was raised at First Church by his loving parents. He was active in youth, choir, and Sunday school. Mike often taught in our Sunday school class, Open Doors. That man knew the Bible and spent many hours researching things in the Bible. If he didn't know the answer, next week he would come back into our class and he would tell us what he had found. Mike and his wife were married 3 times. Not once, but 3 times. The first time they were married on March the 22nd, 1995. The second time was at First Church on June the 15th, 1995. The third time they were married by Elvis in Vegas at a little white chapel. Mike had 2 daughters, Taylor and Brianna. He also loved and cherished his 2 grandsons that he and Carrie were raising. Mike loved being a part of Family Promise. He was instrumental in the ministry at First Church. He also took much joy in doing random acts of kindness around town. A well-respected attorney, Mike practiced for 35 years in town. Mike loved to ride his Harley. If the weather was pretty, he was on his bike. He loved going to Sturgis. Mike traveled the roads from Maine, California, Mississippi, and Cherokee, just to name a few. Carrie said that they would pray before every ride, and the last ride was no different. Mike would be so happy to know that Carrie and the boys were baptized recently and that she is bringing them up in a godly home where he set a good example. Mike took his last breath in April of 2023. Today, the church remembers Michael Kellum.
Linda Hodge.
Linda Moore Hodge was a lifelong member of First United Methodist Church. She had one son, Perry Hodge III, who was also raised in this church, and he was a member of the youth group. And Linda really enjoyed accompanying the youth when they would go on their trips as a chaperone. She moved away from this area for a few years, and when she returned, she taught 3rd grade at Westview School in Washington County, and she did that for 30 years. She was known for her fairness and as well as her passion for learning. She also was over the ceramic room for several years, and she made many beautiful items as well as teaching those of us who wanted to learn how to do ceramics. Today, the church remembers Linda Hodge.
Dalton Gough.
I remember Dalton Gough. Dalton came into our church lives when he married our precious Marie Kellum. Marie and Dalton sat in the pew behind Fred and me, so we talked to them every Sunday, and we got to know them. Dalton was a wonderful storyteller. The story that I remember the most was about his deployment to the Aleutian Islands during World War II. Now, Dalton loved bluegrass music. Anybody that knew him knew this. He also loved the pot roast at Clarence's on Sunday. Now, Dalton was a wonderful caregiver. He cared for Marie until she died. He was devastated by her death, but yet on Sunday morning, he was always in their pew. It was during this time that Ann Sharp and I began to give him a great big hug, and then we would talk to him until the service began. Quite a while later, Dalton came bearing gifts. He had a little bag for Ann and a little bag for me. And inside that bag was a Royal Dalton figurine. He told us that it had come from his wife's collection, his first wife's collection. We thanked him profusely, but were a little bit dumbfounded by all of this. But I told him, I said, Dalton, this will never be a Royal Dalton. It will always be a Royal Dalton figurine. She sits in my little living room, and every time I look at her, I remember the kindest, most wonderful gentleman named Dalton Gough. Today, the church remembers Dalton Gough.
Louise Scott.
Louise Scott was an interesting lady who lived to be 98 years old, one of our oldest members. She was born, went to school, and spent most of her life in Ohio. But in 2013, she and her husband Walter moved to Johnson City and found First Church. They lived in the towers. They were neighbors of Jim and Belle Crowder. Louise enjoyed painting, square dancing, and round dancing. And I think one of the most interesting things about her was that after a career of real estate, she became a Tai Chi instructor. Perhaps only a few of us really knew Louise because she was not able to be a very active part of the church family, but she appreciated the contacts and visits from those who knew her. Today, the church remembers Louise Scott.